Samuel for good measure.
You could throw in 1st and 2nd Samuel. You could also throw in, I thank you. You could throw in Judges and Joshua and Judges. You could call them histories. Would you call Exodus history?
Yes. 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 It's also history, and it also is the law.
That's right. It is law. It is a story.
I'm hanging around this stuff.
It's also filled with myths and legends.
Yeah.
So I would say that here we have when you talk about Exodus, it would be helpful for you to think this way, I think. You don't have to agree with me. If you think of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as Torah, as a different form than Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So if you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you're actually reading a narrative of history, quote unquote. When you're reading the others, you're reading something else. And just try to keep that apart for a while. We'll talk about it more when we talk about the Torah, but just think about it a little more. I want to show you, though, that even the history books in the Hebrew Scriptures don't claim themselves to be the definitive histories. So I'm going to only give you two examples. 1 Kings, chapter 22. This verse is actually repeated several times in the Old Testament. But the names are changed, but the melody lingers on. 1 Kings chapter 22, 45 and 46. So Kings is a history, right? That's what we're saying. But look at 22, 45, and 46. Lots of chapters in 1st and 2nd Kings end with a form of what you're going to read. If somebody gets it, just read it.
And now the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat, and his might that he showed, and how he warred, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And the remnant of the male cult prostitutes who remained in the days of his father Asa, he exterminated from the land.
Okay. We'll get to male cult prostitutes someday. But notice that this is a book in the Bible, is telling us that there's a more accurate history, a more official history. It's the book of it's not Chronicles in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. It's not the next book of the Bible. It's the Chronicles of the Acts. What's the
book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah.
So somebody in the royal court is taking notes, sort of like minutes at meetings. And they're the official records. And this is based on those records. Interestingly enough, the writer of that of 1 Kings thinks that the person who's reading 1 Kings knows about those records and where you can find them, where you can find them. So it doesn't purport to be history. It purports to be based on a history of which there's a more accurate chronicle, a more official chronicle. It may not be more accurate, it's more official. So when we talk about histories, and by the way, that line, you happen to pick I picked Jehoshaphat, but you can read the story of any king, and at the end of the story, the same question will be asked. Are not these things written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings, blah, 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 blah. The other thing that's repeated in these books that I love is that the writer always makes a judgment on the king he tells about. And this is how he makes the judgment. You'll love this. Jehoshaphat, for instance, is a good king. In Chronicles, it'll say, and Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers. And and whoever follows him, Jehoash, reigned in his stead. But Asa's a bad king. So if you read about Asa's end, it says, Asa died and was buried. And Jehoshaphat reigned in his stead. So you can always tell a good king from a bad king in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, by how they died. Those who are buried, just buried, they are bad, really bad. Those who sleep with their fathers, they're buried in the ancestral tombs. These are the good guys. There aren't a lot of them. But it's just a little teeny clue that pops right out of the Scriptures. But you wouldn't know that because, you know, you'd have to read the story and say, what's the difference? What's the difference between, you know, dead and buried and sleeping with your ancestors? Well, that's the difference. And you don't have to read the rest of the chapter because that tells you pretty much the judgment on it. In Jehoshaphat's case, he's a good king because he cleans up all the worship of false gods. And that little tagline about male cult prostitutes. One way to worship a false god is with a male cult prostitute. Another way is with a female cult prostitute. There's a whole bunch of issues that deal with that. But cult prostitutes and the sex that goes on between people and cult prostitutes is not the same thing as homosexuality. It is false worship. The problem is idolatry in this case, not sexual relationships. It's worth knowing that. And when our friend from Denmark is here sometime in October, he's actually written a paper on that. Not Pele, no, this is somebody else I've got coming, and I can't remember his name. His last name is Ling, L-I-N-G. He wrote me and says, I'm coming, you got anything for me to do? And I said, yeah, you can come and be at this class. I mean, why have somebody who's an expert on the subject and not use them? If you look at, I saw you, so don't worry. Look at, just so you see this again, 2 Chronicles chapter 12. That's 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
2nd Chronicles?
2nd Chronicles, so it's the end of the book, chapter 12. Verses 45 to 46. No, I'm sorry, verses 15 and 16, I'm sorry. 12, 15, 16. So this is that guy, Rehoboam. So 15, now the acts of Rehoboam, from first to last, are they not written in the records of the prophet Shemaiah and of the seer Iddo, recorded by genealogy? There were continual wars between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, and his son Abijah succeeded in him. This is the only guy who was both bad and good. And you could, if you read the story, you'll find out about that. So, again, they're referring you to another history. That's my point. So the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles is not just writing history. He's interpreting what the history means. And here's a little hint. 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written by two different writers, but they tell about the same periods of history. So you can actually find places in 1st and 2nd Kings that read exactly like the stuff in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because they probably knew about each other, and they probably copied one from the other. So there's stuff, but they tell the stories with a slightly different twist. Our problem as people who only go to church, mostly, these are liturgical Christians, is that we hardly ever read these histories. So you have trouble placing where a king is, what country the king is the leader in, and you have trouble figuring out where they fit historically, and it's easy to get yourself, you know, it's a lot of complaints from professional theologians is that people are biblically illiterate, by which they mean they don't know the story. Well, we don't read the story. It's not your fault you're biblically illiterate. You don't read the story, so how would you know whether Jeroboam or Asa came first and that, why it matters? Why it matters? Or whether Jeroboam was the king in Israel or in Judah, and why that matters. it's just all bunched together. So I'm hoping at the end of this year, having spent a little time just going over what the history is, you'll feel a lot better about the story. You may not be able to do this, but you know, at the top of your head, I can't do it yet, and I've been doing this a long time. But you'll at least have an idea what the issues are. So that's another form, and that's the form called history. I want to do two more, I hope. One is prophecy, and I'd like you to look at the 5th chapter of Isaiah. This is the very first passage in the Hebrew Scriptures I translated as a student of Hebrew. Isaiah is after the Psalms. I love this passage. Chapter 5. And you only need to read the first two verses. And it's in a way I'm cheating because Isaiah chapter 5 is not only prophecy, it is also exquisite poetry.
Now I will sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes.
So, just try to picture the scene. Just don't forget the Bible for a minute. Just picture the scene. A lover and his beloved. And the lover plants a garden, a vineyard. And the beloved is expecting to come and be able to eat the fruit of the vineyard. So you have this beautiful picture of this wonderful garden, lovingly cared for and protected. There's a fence, there's a wall around it, and watered and fertilized. And now I come to get the grapes, and the grapes are, wild grapes is one way to read that. Another way to read it is sour grapes. So what happens when you eat sour grapes? You can't turn them into wine, you're going to make a face. You're going to be upset. So, it goes on to be very, very specific. Now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done for it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? I couldn't do any more. It's God speaking. So then he tells what he's going to do with the vineyard. I will tell you what I will do. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. It's just when the hedge is gone, the weeds come in. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. By what? By the wild beasts who were out in the field. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, because I'm not doing this anymore. It shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no more upon it. For the vineyard of Yahweh, the Lord, is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. And there's an important little piece for you. Vineyard of the Lord, pleasant planting. A lot of times you're going to find in the poetry of the Bible what are called parallelisms, where the same thing is said two different ways, but they make exactly the same point. Here's the most famous. Do you know the most famous? The most famous is in the book of Zephaniah, where it talks about the king coming into the city, riding on an ass, a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey, which is quoted in Matthew's Gospel. You sing it when you sing it, the St. Matthew Passion. And here's my question to you. How many donkeys did Jesus ride on? If you read it the way Matthew tells it, it's two donkeys. Jesus sort of rode on top of two donkeys. But that's a parallelism. A colt of a donkey and a donkey are the same thing. One animal. It's just a parallelism, and it happens all the time. So here you have vineyard, pleasant planting. They mean the same thing. it's a poetic way of repeating yourself. And if you read the Psalms, especially if you read the Psalms, you see this happens over and over and over again. But here's the fun part of this passage. For the vineyard of Yahweh is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice but saw bloodshed, righteousness but heard a cry. So the grapes expected are justice and righteousness. And what he gets instead is the sour grapes, bloodshed and a cry. And here's the fun thing about that passage. And you can't do it in English. Can't be done. But it's so cool. The difference between justice and bloodshed is one letter. Which if you think they're all consonants, it's one consonant. And the difference between justice and a cry is one letter. So mishpat is justice. Mishpah, with an H at the end, is bloodshed. So imagine hearing it in its original language, where you get this, I expected this, and even if you're not listening carefully, you might even miss it. But it really catches you because it's one little letter off.
Is that
Twice.
the same root word though?
No, they're two different root words. They're different consonants. Two different root words, but the effect of it is, which you really don't quite get it in English because, what does it mean to you, justice and bloodshed? The opposite of justice is bloodshed in this passage. The opposite of righteousness is a cry of what? An anguished cry. So parallelism, I wanted to show you as a poetry piece, and I want to show you that prophecy is not simply prediction of what's going to happen or what God's going to do to cause bad things to happen. Almost everybody thinks of prophecy as whenever a prophet speaks, something awful is going to happen. If you think about this passage, God says, okay, I'm just going to simply step back. And the results of what you're doing will be felt by the environment, will be caused by the environment around you. One could say that global warming is our fault and that God is punishing us. Or one could say that global warming is our fault and all of the restraints have been removed and now we're simply reaping the results of our bad behavior.
Cause and effect.
Right. So it's not, so that piece that we always throw in there, God is getting you, might not be what the prophets are trying to do. It's very seldom is it predictive prophecy. It's really prophecy about how God is keeping and promises and how we are experiencing, I don't mind me hearing, experiencing judgment. And the judgment is usually something that happens to us as a consequence that, with or without God, would be a consequence. The promise is what the prophet is trying to get people to cling to and not do all the crazy things they do. So prophecy is a kind of a different kind of form, but it can also often use poetry. And one more. How do I do it? Oh, great. And that's because this is the one that gets read. The two most popular books of the Bible. Anybody know what the two, if you were to read books written in books that are in Barnes & Noble in the religious world, Teddy's going to fall over. Don't fall, Teddy. If you're going to read books, religious books, Christian books, buy them at Barnes & Noble, or you're going to listen to the vast majority of American sermons. What two books of the Bible are the most popular books in the United States today?
Gospel of John.
No.
Isaiah.
No.
Revelation.
Revelation is number one. Number two is Daniel. Apocalyptic literature are the single most popular. Every time you guys get upset about the rest of those Christians who are doing bad things and you get angry about it, I guarantee you, they're quoting from Revelation or Daniel. And what they're saying is that all this bad stuff happening, it's happening to you. But God's coming back on the side of the good guys. God's going to get all the bad guys. If you want to see this in its flaming worst, read the Left Behind series. The second most popular set of religious books in the United States. The only book sold more in the United States is the Bible, King James Version. Second most popular book sold in the United States, now available in paperback, in cartoons for children, and in video games, and in movies. So it's really popular. Is the Left Behind series, which is supposedly based on the book of Revelation. When you can actually, you really have a really bad night, you know, nothing's happening, and you want to really get yourself, maybe it's a cold night, you want to warm up, download or get from Netflix the first Left Behind series. It stars Kirk Cameron, child star now, and in the story, Kurt's one of the guys who gets left behind when the rapture happens. And ultimately, they haven't made the movie yet, they haven't made the video game. At the very end, Jesus comes back and wipes out the Jews, the Muslims, the Buddhists, everybody else but a few left behind perfect Christians, of which Kurt is one. But I digress. Most popular literature. So when you get into conversations with people that, you know, are of that ilk, they're probably going to quote from Revelation and Daniel. So, two things about apocalyptic literature. And you can look at this anytime you want, but think of a story in Daniel. Anybody know a story in Daniel? We read one at the Easter Vigil every year.
The lion's den.
Daniel and the lion's den. Right.
Or the
No,
fiery
no,
furnace.
the fiery furnace.
Shadrach,
Right?
Meshach, and
Fiery
Abednego.
furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they get, right. King Nebuchadnezzar,
King of Babylon.
and Babylon. So the story is purported to take place during the exile. Purported to take place during the exile. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, most famous Babylonian king, next to Hammurabi, who left us laws. Nebuchadnezzar builds a furnace, and everybody's supposed to worship the Babylonian gods. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are good guys. They're Jews. They're very, very handsome. They are very, very careful with what they eat. I mean, the story is really fantastic. They're pure. They keep themselves pure. And when they don't get to when they're forced to worship the false god, they refuse. And so Nebuchadnezzar gets really, really angry, heats up the furnace, throws them in, and they don't burn up. It's the end of the readings at the Easter Vigil. Everybody's happy. We all go to the font and cool off. It's a great story. Here's the point I want to make about both kinds of, both Revelation and that. There's a lot more to be said, but we'll do that in spring. Apocalyptic literature is always written to people under a great deal of pressure, mostly about their faith. They are in danger of losing everything. And the need is, there are several needs. One is to remain pure. And the other is to remain faithful and don't succumb to the pressures to commit idolatry, whatever that is. It's always written about a period other than the one the people are in. So Daniel is not written at the same time as they're in Persia. We know this for several reasons. Among them is it's not written in Hebrew. It's written in Aramaic. It's the only book of the Bible written in Aramaic. So it's written later. And it's written probably during the period in the 200s when the Greeks are in charge, the Alexandrian generals after Alexander, and they are forcing Jews to stop acting like Jews. And they sacrifice a pig on the altar in Jerusalem, which is sort of makes that place unusable. And the people are succumbing to this, and this is a call to them to be strong under persecution, which is exactly what Revelation is. It's a story to people in New Testament times under a Roman emperor who needs to be, they need to be protected from that. They need to rally themselves. And so you use code words about another time to identify the people you're dealing with. So Nebuchadnezzar in this case is really not Nebuchadnezzar. It's the person who was the king of that particular part of the empire. His name was Seleucus, and you don't need to know that. Who was forcing Jews to stop being Jews. In the book of Revelation, it talks about 7 crowned beasts with 7 heads, and I mean, there's no question. What does the number 7?
7 hills of Rome.
7 hills of Rome. It's about the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The Roman Empire is never mentioned.
No?
In fact, Babylon is mentioned, again, just like in Daniel. So people talk about these books as predicting the future. Who are the 4 kingdoms in Daniel? Well, they must be Nazi Germany, Russia. I mean, the last one is always changed to be the bad guy of the moment. Who is the beast with a 666? Could be Barack Obama. Could be the United Nations. That's another whole bunch of things. So you try to identify forward from the period what the book is about. So the book's about my problems now. It looks back at another time in history when people needed to be faithful. It doesn't look forward about problems yet to come. It's not that kind of book. Apocalyptic uses imagery, usually wild and crazy imagery, to get you to be faithful at the toughest time of your life. Especially when everything, including your whole surroundings, your government, your social network, everything around you is pressing you to do something idolatrous. So it's written for a very different period. Hard to see those books that's written to people who are, no matter what station they have, who are the citizens of the richest country in the world. In fact, the richest country in the world is always the bad guy in those two stories. So apocalyptic is specific. It uses wild imagery. It uses something about the past to get you to be faithful in your situation now, not to predict the future. So the whole enterprise of figuring out who's who is a little much. I happen to get hooked on the TV show Under the Dome.
Oh, yes.
And the very last one, one of the persons, I won't tell you how it ends, I'll just tell you that one person, as things get really bad, starts quoting about the sky turning black and the sun and the moon being darkened. And then the show ends, the season finale. But the point is that they're looking at something that's happening and trying to say, well, God predicted this a long time ago. Nah. It's about something that already happened and how it's told in a way that can boost you up. I want to be like Daniel, right? And I want to know that even though I'm getting, thousands and thousands of people are getting slaughtered, if I remain faithful, that's not the last word. So that's just a bunch of different kinds of literature in the Bible. There are more. We're going to spend a lot of time with this. But next week, what I really want to focus on is the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and hopefully by the end of that, you'll have a kind of a picture of why we have 4 Gospels. And that'll be next week. And then the following week, the 2nd of October, will be a look at the sources of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's nothing on the 9th, and then starting on the 16th, we're going to actually delve into Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
So
All right?